In the early hours of the morning, my phone lit up with a text message from my own son. It read, "Dad, plans changed. You are not coming on the cruise next week. Monica wants only her family there." The very next day, I canceled the payments, sold the house they lived in, and left town. When they came back from their luxurious vacation, the house they thought they owned was gutted to the studs. Before I dive into exactly how I systematically dismantled their perfect little lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an entitled family member a harsh lesson in reality. My name is Harrison Caldwell. I am 70 years old, and for 40 years I ran a ruthless construction contracting business right here in Seattle. It was a Tuesday, 6 in the morning. The Seattle sky outside my window was still that heavy, wet gray that clings to the city for months. I was sitting at my kitchen table nursing a black coffee. The house was quiet. It had been painfully quiet for 3 years, ever since my wife Diane passed away. I was just staring at the empty chair across from me, thinking about her, when my phone buzzed on the cold granite countertop. It was a text from Derek, my 34-year-old son. A man I had broken my back on construction sites to provide for. I picked up the phone expecting a simple question about our upcoming trip, maybe a question about the flight times or the luggage tags. Instead, the words on the glowing screen hit me like a physical blow to the chest. "Dad, plans changed. You are not coming on the cruise next week. Monica wants only her family there." I just sat there in the dim light of the kitchen. I read the message over and over again, trying to make the letters mean something else. "You are not coming on the cruise. Monica wants only her family there." My chest tightened. Let me give you some necessary context so you understand exactly what I was looking at. This was not a cheap weekend getaway to a local resort. This was a 10-day ultra-luxury Alaskan cruise. I had paid exactly $45,000 for it, putting the entire amount on my personal platinum credit card. I did not ask my son or his wife for a single dime. I paid for it because I wanted to honor Diane. Alaska was the one place my wife had always wanted to visit, but we never made it because I was always working, always building, always pouring every ounce of my energy into securing a financial empire for Derek. When she died, I promised myself I would take our son on that trip to celebrate her birthday. I booked the owner suite, the absolute best room on the entire ship, a sprawling luxury suite with panoramic ocean views, a private balcony, and personal butler service. I even prepaid for helicopter tours over the glaciers. I booked it for all of us. Me, Derek, and his 31-year-old wife, Monica. I wanted us to be together. I wanted to share that profound memory with the only family I had left in this world. And now my son was sending me a cowardly text message at 6 in the morning, casually uninviting me from my own $45,000 gift, simply because his wife wanted her family there instead. A cold, heavy silence filled my kitchen. I set my coffee mug down. My hands were perfectly steady. When you spend 4 decades managing massive construction sites, dealing with corrupt suppliers and lazy foremen, you learn very quickly that anger is a completely useless emotion. You do not throw tantrums. You fix the problem. I tapped Derek's name on my screen and hit the call button. I held the phone to my ear, listening to the dialing tone. It rang once, twice, then the line went completely dead. He rejected my call. My own son, the boy I had carried on my shoulders, the man whose expensive college tuition I paid in full with cash, was too much of a coward to even speak to me. Derek had always been spineless. He had gladly traded his mother's tough love upbringing for Monica's manipulative absolute control over his life. I took a deep, stabilizing breath, steeling myself, and dialed the number a second time. This time someone picked up, but it was not Derek. "Hello, Harrison." It was Monica. Her voice was hushed, tightly controlled, and dripping with that fake, elegant politeness she always used when she was about to say something completely toxic. She did not call me Dad. She rarely did. I kept my voice perfectly level, hiding the storm brewing inside me. "Put my son on the phone, Monica." She let out a small, dramatic sigh, clearly annoyed that I was pushing the issue. "Derek is in the shower right now, Harrison," she said smoothly. "And honestly, there is really nothing to discuss. He sent you the text. The plans have changed." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the bleak sky outside. "Monica," I said slowly, choosing my words with absolute precision. "That is a $45,000 trip. I booked the owner suite for us to celebrate Diane. You do not just change the plans and uninvite the person who paid for the entire ticket." I could hear her shifting on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of running water in the background, proving Derek was hiding. Then, she delivered the words that completely shattered whatever fragile illusion of family we had left. "Look, Harrison," she whispered, her tone hardening into something deeply condescending. "My parents have never been on a luxury vacation in their entire lives. They really deserve this experience. Plus, my brother Bradley is coming too. Let us be honest here. Older people like you get sick at sea so easily. It is a huge liability. You would just be tired and complaining the whole time. My parents are in much better shape to actually enjoy the owner suite." I closed my eyes. The sheer audacity of this woman was staggering. She was hijacking my generous gift, my hard-earned money, and my deeply personal tribute to my dead wife to use as a private, all-expenses-paid luxury vacation for her own parents and her deadbeat brother. People who had never contributed a single cent to her life, let alone ours. I stayed utterly silent on the line, letting her disrespectful words hang in the empty air. Monica took my calculated silence as a victory. She thought she had won. She thought she was dealing with a tired, lonely, clueless old man who would just roll over and accept the massive disrespect because he was desperate for family connection. "We will make sure to buy you some nice souvenirs from the ports, Harrison," she added, her voice dripping with artificial pity. "Just stay home. Relax. Enjoy the quiet time alone. We will see you when we get back." And before I could say a single word in response, she ended the call. The line went dead, leaving me alone in the dark kitchen. The line went dead, leaving me alone in the dark kitchen. I slowly pulled the phone away from my ear and set it down on the cold granite island. For a long minute, I simply stood there, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. The sting of Monica's voice still echoed loudly in my head. "Older people like you get sick at sea so easily. You would just be tired and complaining the whole time. In a different life, maybe a different man would have screamed in anger. Maybe he would have violently thrown his coffee mug against the wall, called his son back repeatedly, and demanded a tearful explanation. But I did none of those things. When you spend 40 years running a commercial construction business in Seattle, you learn to process betrayal differently. You do not survive 4 decades of dealing with corrupt suppliers, corner-cutting foremen, and brutal contract negotiations by throwing a helpless tantrum. In my line of work, when a foundation cracks or a massive steel beam buckles under heavy pressure, you do not cry about it. You pull the blueprints, you inspect the structural integrity, and you systematically locate the rot. Then you tear it out with unforgiving precision. I calmly walked out of the kitchen, leaving my coffee untouched on the counter, and made my way down the hall to my private study. The wooden floorboards creaked softly beneath my feet, a highly familiar sound in a house that felt suddenly entirely too empty and incredibly cold. I sat down at my heavy mahogany desk, flipped open my laptop, and waited patiently for the screen to cast its pale blue glow across the quiet room. I needed to see the exact damage for myself. I opened my personal email and quickly found the original booking confirmation from Royal Caribbean. It was a massive receipt. $45,000 charged directly to my personal platinum credit card without a second thought. I remembered the specific day I booked it, sitting right here in this very chair. I had looked at a framed photograph of Diane on my desk, her smiling face from a trip to the coast many years ago, and I had felt a profound sense of purpose. I was buying us a beautiful, lasting memory, a grand, sweeping tribute to the wonderful woman who had held our entire family together. I had carefully selected the owner suite, the absolute crown jewel of the ship, because I truly wanted Derek to experience the kind of extravagant luxury I had worked my entire life to provide. I highlighted the long booking reference number, copied it to my clipboard, and navigated to the official cruise line passenger portal. My hands did not shake as I steadily pasted the code into the secure login field. I hit the enter key. The loading icon spun for a few agonizing seconds, a small blue wheel turning round and round, before the detailed reservation page finally populated on the monitor. I stared blankly at the bright screen. I blinked, leaning much closer, my eyes rapidly scanning the detailed passenger manifest. I scrolled down to the primary guest details section, fully expecting to see my name, Harrison Caldwell, listed prominently, first as the primary account holder and lead passenger. My name was completely gone. It was not moved down to a secondary cabin. It was not downgraded to a standard interior room. It was completely surgically erased from the entire digital system. In the exact space where my name absolutely should have been, boldly occupying the master bedroom of the massive owner suite, was the name Richard Sterling. Right below him was Margaret Sterling, Monica's parents. The very people who had spent the last 5 years making thinly veiled, highly arrogant comments about my blue-collar background, constantly judging the rough calluses on my hands at every single Thanksgiving dinner, were now the primary occupants of a $45,000 luxury suite I had personally paid for. My chest grew tight, a painfully cold knot of realization rapidly forming deep in my stomach, but I deliberately forced myself to keep scrolling. There were 2 more passengers attached to the active reservation: Derek Caldwell and Monica Sterling. That made 4 people. The owner suite was perfectly designed to hold 6 people comfortably. I looked carefully at the final passenger slot, the one that absolutely undeniably should have belonged to me. Instead, I saw the name Bradley Sterling. Bradley, Monica's 32-year-old brother. A profoundly lazy man who had completely dropped out of 2 different local colleges, who had been rightfully fired from 3 different entry-level jobs I had personally secured for him as massive personal favors, and who currently lived rent-free in his parents' basement, actively playing video games all day long. This fully grown adult man, who had never bothered to buy me so much as a cheap cup of coffee, was now officially registered to casually enjoy the private balcony, the personal butler service, and the premium evening dining packages that I had financed with my own blood sweat and decades of grueling physical labor. They had not merely uninvited me. That alone would have been intensely cruel, but this was something entirely different. They had actively logged into my private secure account, deliberately hijacked my paid reservation, and selfishly replaced me with the entire Sterling family. They had completely stolen my deeply personal gift to use as a highly private, all-expenses, paid luxury family vacation for greedy, terrible people who meant absolutely nothing to me. I sat back deeply in my leather chair, fully letting the sheer, horrifying magnitude of the betrayal completely wash over my tired bones. Monica had intricately orchestrated this entire scheme. I knew her ruthless tactics perfectly well. She was an absolute master of silent, deeply toxic control, constantly framing her immensely selfish demands as acts of necessary medical care and profound emotional empathy. She had probably convinced Derek that I was simply too old, too fragile, or too painfully depressing to be around on a fun party trip. She had likely spun an elaborate, highly convincing narrative where taking her family was somehow a tremendous favor to me, gracefully sparing me the extreme physical exhaustion of extended travel across the ocean. And Derek, my spineless, completely cowardly son, had eagerly let her do it. He had willingly allowed his deeply manipulative wife to actively log into the reservation portal, manually delete his deeply grieving father's name, and freely hand over a small fortune in luxury travel to his horrible, condescending in-laws. He had stood by totally silently while they completely ruthlessly hijacked a highly sacred trip explicitly meant to deeply honor his own mother's lasting memory. The betrayal was so incredibly profound, so deeply calculated and viciously malicious, that it instantly and permanently stripped away absolutely any lingering paternal weakness I might have foolishly held onto. I looked intensely at the specific booking details once again. The massive cruise ship was officially scheduled to fully depart in exactly 7 days. Next Tuesday. The official boarding passes were already actively generated and saved. The specialized luggage tags were physically printed. The incredibly expensive premium drink packages were already manually selected. I could clearly see on the screen that Bradley had already happily gone in and successfully upgraded his personal beverage package to the absolute ultimate tier, happily granting him unlimited daily access to incredibly expensive top-shelf liquor. All of these excessive, deeply arrogant charges were linked directly and continuously to my personal platinum credit card, which was incredibly still dutifully stored deeply in the ship system as the primary default payment method for absolutely all ongoing onboard expenses. They actually thought they had finally won. They truly deeply believed they had successfully and completely outmaneuvered me. Monica had smugly sized me up and quickly foolishly decided I was just a highly tired, deeply broken old man who would quietly and obediently absorb the massive, horrible disrespect, who would obediently stay home and sadly accept her profoundly fake pity, simply because I was far too desperate for my son's eventual meager affection to ever cause a major messy scene. She arrogantly thought my heavy silence on the phone earlier was the pathetic, completely submissive silence of a totally, utterly defeated man. She did not actively understand exactly who she was foolishly dealing with. She did not logically understand that a seasoned man who spent 40 incredibly grueling years successfully dominating the highly brutal, entirely unforgiving world of commercial corporate contracting absolutely does not simply quietly surrender his hard-earned personal assets. I absolutely did not build massive, expensive skyscrapers by carelessly letting greedy, terrible people steal my incredibly expensive raw materials. I positively did not successfully amass my large personal wealth by foolishly allowing lazy, deeply entitled parasites to quietly and constantly drain my private bank accounts without extremely serious, highly devastating consequences. I stared intensely at the glowing screen, quietly tracing the arrogant names of the entire Sterling family with my small digital cursor. An incredibly slow, deeply chilling clarity smoothly and completely settled entirely over my busy mind. The profound sadness was entirely gone now, completely instantly evaporated smoothly into the cold morning air. In its absolute place was a highly sharp, intensely focused, heavily tactical, purely destructive energy. I deliberately reached for the yellow legal notepad I constantly kept perfectly centered, firmly on my wooden desk, quietly clicking my heavy metal pen. I actively started writing down a highly detailed, extremely precise list. I absolutely did not quickly cancel the extremely expensive cruise tickets right then. That exact move would have been entirely too simple, far too incredibly easy. That specific choice would have only been a mere highly temporary inconvenience for them to eventually fix. I desperately, completely wanted them to happily pack their highly expensive designer bags. I fully wanted them to happily drive together to the busy, crowded port. I positively wanted them to successfully board that massive luxury ship fully, feel the fresh, cold ocean breeze, and fully deeply experience the highly arrogant thrill of their totally stolen victory. I intensely wanted them safely, completely trapped on that massive metal ship. I confidently closed the silver laptop with a highly quiet, beautifully definitive, extremely satisfying snap. The fragile foundation of our entire family had not just slightly cracked under pressure, it was entirely rotten to the very core. And it was exactly time to absolutely bring the whole heavy structure down. My smartphone vibrated against the hard granite surface of the kitchen island, breaking the heavy silence of the early morning. I looked down at the bright screen. The caller identification displayed Derek's name in bold black letters. It had been exactly 22 minutes since Monica had abruptly hung up on me. 22 minutes of absolute silence while my son presumably gathered the tiny fraction of courage required to finally face his own father. I let the phone vibrate 3 separate times. I wanted him to sweat. I wanted him to sit in the uncomfortable tension of his own cowardly actions before I granted him an audience. On the 4th long ring, I reached out and slowly swiped the green icon to accept the call. I brought the device to my ear and simply breathed, waiting for him to speak first. I did not offer a warm greeting. I just let the empty dead air press heavily against his guilty conscience. "Dad, are you there?" Derek's voice came through the small speaker. It was noticeably shaky, thin, and stretched incredibly tight with nervous anxiety. "Yes, Derek, I am here," I replied. My voice was completely flat, entirely devoid of any warm parental affection. It was the exact same tone of voice I used to use when dealing with a highly dishonest concrete supplier who thought he could safely cut corners on a massive commercial building project. I heard my son swallow hard over the line. "Listen, Dad." He started immediately stammering over his own carefully rehearsed words. "I am really sorry about how all of this is suddenly coming out." Monica did not mean to sound harsh on the phone earlier. It is just that we are dealing with a highly sensitive, very complicated medical situation right now. I remained completely silent, forcing him to desperately fill the uncomfortable void. Monica has been struggling with severe clinical depression for the last few months. Derek continued, his voice dropping into a hushed, dramatically serious whisper. Her licensed therapist strongly suggested that she desperately needs a completely stress-free, entirely supportive emotional environment to properly heal. The medical professional specifically recommended that she spend some quality, uninterrupted healing time with just her immediate family. Her parents and her brother know exactly how to manage her delicate emotional triggers. I listened to this pathetic, meticulously constructed lie, absolutely pouring out of my 34-year-old son's mouth. The sheer level of sophisticated manipulation was genuinely staggering. They were actively weaponizing the concept of mental health to casually justify stealing a $45,000 luxury vacation. I knew perfectly well that Monica was not suffering from severe clinical depression. Just 3 days ago, I had personally seen her wildly celebrating with a large group of her loud friends at an incredibly expensive downtown Seattle restaurant, drinking premium cocktails and laughing until she could barely stand up. This entire therapy narrative was an incredibly convenient, perfectly timed excuse, uniquely designed to paint me as the villain if I dared to object to their outright theft. "It is just for her mental health, Dad." Derek pleaded, sounding increasingly desperate for my blind validation. "You know how important family support is during a major psychological crisis. We did not want to burden you with her heavy emotional baggage on what is supposed to be a fun, relaxing trip. You would just be stressed out trying to accommodate her strict dietary needs and her therapy schedules. It is honestly much better for everyone if you just stay home and relax in peace. We fully intend to pay you back for your specific ticket eventually. Once our personal finances stabilize a bit, we will set up a monthly payment plan to slowly reimburse you for the money. Please, Dad. Just try to understand our incredibly difficult position. Please do not ruin this important healing journey for us by getting unnecessarily angry." I closed my eyes, feeling a profound, heavy wave of utter disappointment completely wash over me. I thought about my late wife, Diane. She had been a fiercely strong, incredibly resilient woman who absolutely believed in the strict, unforgiving concept of personal accountability. When Derek was a teenager, if he ever tried to avoid taking direct responsibility for his own foolish mistakes, Diane would confidently march him straight back to the scene of the problem and force him to look the offended party dead in the eyes while he delivered a genuine apology. She raised him with tough love, trying to mold his soft clay into a solid, dependable man. But the devastating truth was that Derek had always been inherently weak. He had absolutely zero structural integrity. The very moment he left our strict household and met Monica, he had eagerly and completely surrendered his own spine. He actively traded his strong, demanding mother for a deeply controlling, heavily manipulative wife who expertly dictated his every single move. I knew, with absolute terrifying certainty, that Derek was currently standing in a quiet corner of his massive house reading directly from a specialized mental script that Monica had drilled into his head just minutes before. He was nothing but a frightened puppet dutifully reciting his master's lines. He actually believed that dangling the vague, entirely empty promise of a future payment plan would magically pacify my mounting rage. He genuinely thought that mentioning a fictional long-term reimbursement schedule for a massive $45,000 credit card charge would successfully blind me to the immediate reality of their vicious betrayal. I knew perfectly well that I would never see a single dime of that money from them. They lived entirely beyond their actual means, constantly drowning in superficial debt, just to maintain a highly curated, profoundly fake image of extreme wealth on their various social media profiles. The idea that they would suddenly develop the sharp financial discipline required to slowly pay back tens of thousands of dollars was an absolute laughable fantasy. But I did not point out the glaring logical flaws in his pathetic story. I did not loudly demand to see this supposed therapist's official medical notes. I did not scream about the blatant, horrific disrespect of replacing my name with Bradley's name on a trip designed to honor my dead wife. Instead, I smoothly leaned into the carefully constructed lie. I deliberately forced every single trace of anger, betrayal, and sorrow completely out of my voice. I took a slow, deep breath, perfectly mimicking the gentle, deeply understanding tone of a highly sympathetic, thoroughly defeated old father who simply wanted his son to be happy. "All right, son," I said softly. My voice was smooth, quiet, and completely non-threatening. If Monica is truly struggling with such a severe, complicated medical issue, then of course she needs to be surrounded by her own parents. Mental health is incredibly important. I completely understand why you had to change the passenger details so abruptly. You do not need to worry about me. I will be perfectly fine staying here at the house. Just focus entirely on taking good care of your wife and making sure she gets the peaceful, healing environment she desperately needs. There was a sharp, sudden intake of breath over the phone line. I could literally hear the massive, incredibly heavy weight of profound anxiety completely lifting right off Derek's shoulders. The absolute relief in his voice was palpable, almost sickeningly sweet. "Really, Dad?" He asked, his tone instantly shifting from desperate panic to bubbling, highly arrogant excitement. "You are not incredibly mad at us? I mean, I know it is a huge, sudden change of plans, and I was so deeply worried you would completely blow up at me over the financial aspects of the tickets." "I am not mad at all, Derek." I lied effortlessly. My face was a cold, expressionless mask of pure stone. A father's only job is to properly support his son during difficult times. You go on your trip, enjoy the fresh ocean air, have a wonderful, relaxing time with the Sterling family. We can easily discuss all the boring financial details and the specific reimbursement plans whenever you get back to Seattle. There is absolutely no rush. "Thank you, Dad." Derek gushed, completely falling into the massive invisible trap I had just perfectly laid out for him. "You are the absolute best. Seriously, this means the entire world to Monica and me. We will definitely bring you back something incredibly nice from the glaciers. I have to go help Monica finish packing the last of her specialized therapy items, but I will text you right before we board the ship next week. I love you, Dad." "I love you too, son," I replied calmly. "Have a very safe and highly memorable journey." I pulled the phone away from my ear and deliberately ended the call. The screen went completely dark, reflecting my own hard, unsmiling face in the black glass. Derek had eagerly bought the entire performance. He genuinely, truly believed that his clueless, overly generous old father had completely swallowed their pathetic fairy tale without a single moment of critical hesitation. He was likely walking back into his master bedroom right now, proudly flashing a victorious smile at his heavily manipulative wife, confidently assuring her that the stupid old man was successfully handled and safely out of their way. They thought they had securely won the absolute ultimate prize. They confidently believed they were about to embark on the most incredibly luxurious, entirely free vacation of their entire superficial lives. But they were completely catastrophically wrong. The real war had not even officially begun yet, and my deeply arrogant son had absolutely no idea that he had just casually handed me the exact tactical ammunition I desperately needed to thoroughly, systematically destroy his perfectly curated, profoundly fake life. I sat in the absolute silence of my study, slowly steepling my fingers together, entirely ready to initiate the next devastating phase of my response. I sat in the absolute silence of my study, slowly steepling my fingers together, entirely ready to initiate the next devastating phase of my response. The heavy mahogany clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the slow passage of time. Suddenly, the quiet atmosphere was shattered by a sharp, vibrating buzz from the smartphone resting on my desk. The screen illuminated the dim room with a harsh white light. I leaned forward and picked up the device, fully expecting another text message from Derek, perhaps a hollow apology, or another carefully crafted lie to ensure I was completely pacified. Instead, the notification banner displayed the bright blue logo of my primary financial institution. It was an automated security alert. My brow furrowed in mild confusion. I swiped the screen to unlock the phone and opened the secure banking application. The alert was directly tied to a specific checking account, one that I rarely monitored because it was explicitly meant to remain completely dormant. It was a joint emergency checking account that I officially shared with Derek. This account was a deeply sentimental relic from a completely different era of our lives. Many years ago, when Derek first moved out of our family house to attend college, my late wife Diane had firmly insisted that we establish a shared financial safety net for him. Diane was an incredibly loving mother, but she was also exceptionally practical and fiercely protective. She wanted to ensure that if our only son ever found himself in a genuine crisis, a sudden medical emergency, a major car breakdown, or a catastrophic living situation, he would have immediate, unquestioned access to liquid funds without having to wait for banking hours or cross-country wire transfers. I had initially argued against the idea, firmly believing that a young man needed to learn how to actively manage his own financial hardships to build real character. But Diane had looked at me with those piercing, uncompromising eyes and quietly demanded that we provide him with a silent, permanent pillar of financial security. I dutifully deposited a very generous sum of cash into that specific account and effectively forgot about it. Over the passing decades, even after Derek successfully graduated, found a lucrative corporate career, and eventually married Monica, I never bothered to officially close the account or remove his name from the authorized user list. I simply kept a substantial cushion of liquid cash resting in the vault, quietly honoring my sacred promise to Diane to always provide a safe harbor for our child. For years, the balance had remained entirely untouched. Derek clearly knew the strict rules of the arrangement. The money was exclusively reserved for absolute life-altering emergencies. I slowly tapped the push notification, prompting the mobile banking application to instantly load the detailed transaction history for the joint emergency account. The digital screen refreshed, and my eyes locked onto the bold black numbers proudly displayed at the very top of the ledger. My heart skipped a remarkably heavy beat. The total available balance had been drastically and completely reduced. I frantically scrolled down to the recent activity section, my vision rapidly narrowing on the most recent line items. There, glowing with stark digital clarity, were 3 back-to-back cash withdrawals. Each individual withdrawal was for the exact same incredibly specific numerical amount, $9,900. I stared intensely at the bright screen, letting the cold mathematical reality completely wash over my racing mind. 3 consecutive transactions of $9,900 flawlessly executed within mere minutes of each other, efficiently pulling a massive total of $29,700 of raw untraceable cash directly out of my private emergency reserves. The warm blood in my veins instantly turned to absolute ice. As a hardened man who spent 40 grueling years actively managing highly complex commercial construction budgets, aggressively dealing with massive union payrolls, and skillfully navigating strict corporate banking regulations, I knew exactly what that highly specific number meant. You absolutely do not withdraw exactly $9,900 from a bank by mere coincidence. In the United States financial system, any single cash transaction of $10,000 or more automatically triggers a mandatory currency transaction report directly to the federal government. It is a strictly enforced legal requirement specifically designed to aggressively monitor and routinely prevent illicit financial activities and criminal money laundering. By deliberately and carefully keeping each individual cash withdrawal just exactly $100 under that major legal reporting threshold, whoever physically took the money was actively engaging in a highly calculated, deeply illegal financial maneuver commonly known as structuring. They were intentionally, maliciously bypassing sophisticated federal monitoring systems. They desperately wanted to pull a massive, life-changing amount of liquid cash completely out of the banking system without ever generating any official corporate banking flags or prompting any automated security phone calls to the primary account holder. They were not simply stealing my expensive luxury vacation to Alaska. They were actively, systematically draining my liquid financial assets, while simultaneously feeding me a pathetic, entirely fictional, emotional sob story about Monica supposedly suffering from severe clinical depression. The profound sheer audacity of their multi-layered criminal deception was physically sickening. Derek had literally just spent 10 long minutes on the telephone, practically begging for my deepest paternal sympathy, emotionally describing his wife as a fragile, deeply troubled woman who desperately needed a peaceful family retreat to simply function in society. All the while, they had already brilliantly orchestrated a highly illegal, heavily calculated extraction of nearly $30,000 in completely untraceable cash. I placed the phone down on the wooden desk, my breathing perfectly even, but my mind operating at a terrifying, hypervigilant speed. Why would a married couple living in a beautiful, extremely expensive Bellevue mansion ever desperately need $30,000 in raw physical cash? You absolutely do not use unrecorded stacks of $100 bills to pay for normal, legitimate household expenses, like utility bills, premium groceries, or luxury car insurance. You do not need carefully structured physical currency to comfortably enjoy a paid luxury cruise vacation where absolutely every single premium amenity is neatly linked to a digital cabin card. Untraceable cash is exclusively gathered and utilized for only one specific purpose. It is purposely used to secretly pay for highly illicit goods or incredibly shady under-the-table services that cannot ever legally leave a permanent paper trail. My son was not just a weak, pathetic coward who had allowed his terrible wife to casually disrespect his grieving father. He was now an active, incredibly brazen participant in a major financial conspiracy aimed directly at my personal wealth. The intricate pieces of the dark puzzle were finally clicking together with devastating clarity. The sudden cancellation of my cruise ticket, the inclusion of Monica's highly questionable family, the deeply manipulative, thoroughly rehearsed phone call, and now the massive, highly illegal structuring of cash withdrawals from an account they genuinely thought I was entirely too old and completely too oblivious to actively monitor. They had truly crossed the point of no return. I absolutely had to uncover exactly why. I closed the banking application on my phone and pushed my leather chair back from the mahogany desk. The quiet morning air in my study felt suddenly heavy, thick, with the undeniable reality of my son's deceit. $30,000 in structured cash withdrawals was not a simple misunderstanding. It was a massive, deliberate maneuver to bypass federal banking security executed by someone who desperately needed untraceable funds. I needed to see Derek face to face. I needed to look him directly in the eyes and see the truth for myself. I stood up, grabbed my heavy wool coat from the hallway closet, and walked out the front door into the crisp, gray Seattle morning. I climbed into my truck and started the engine. The drive from my quiet neighborhood to the upscale suburbs of Bellevue usually took about 30 minutes across the floating bridge, but today, the journey felt like an eternity. The rhythmic thumping of the tires over the concrete expansion joints matched the furious beating of my heart. As I navigated the winding tree-lined streets of Bellevue, the modest homes gradually gave way to sprawling multi-million-dollar estates. The neighborhood was an exclusive enclave of manicured lawns, pristine private driveways, and towering evergreens. It was a place designed for profound comfort and absolute security. I turned the steering wheel and slowly approached the specific cul-de-sac where Derek and Monica lived. I did not pull directly into their expansive driveway. My gut instinct, honed by decades of dealing with highly deceitful contractors and hostile business negotiations, warned me to remain completely unseen. I drove past their property, parked my truck discreetly 2 full blocks away, and turned off the ignition. I sat in the silent cabin for a moment, simply staring at my calloused hands resting on the steering wheel. I stepped out of the vehicle and began the short walk down the pristine sidewalk. The cold morning air bit at my face, but I barely felt it. My mind was entirely focused on the massive structure standing at the end of the street. It was a stunning, modern architectural masterpiece valued at $2.2 million. I knew the exact appraisal value because I was the one who had purchased the property. When Derek and Monica were first married, they had endlessly complained about the soaring cost of living and their inability to afford a decent home in a safe neighborhood. I wanted to give my only son the ultimate head start in life, a solid foundation that I had to fight tooth and nail to build for myself. I had bought the Bellevue estate entirely in cash. I did not want them burdened by a suffocating 30-year mortgage or crippled by fluctuating interest rates. However, my veteran business sense had prevailed over pure parental emotion. I legally placed the entire property into a strict revocable living trust. I retained ultimate control of the deed, but I allowed them to live there completely rent-free. I even paid the exorbitant annual property taxes and the hefty homeowners association fees out of my own pocket. I provided them with a flawless, luxurious existence totally free of any housing expenses. All they had to do was maintain the property and build their lives. And now they were using the absolute financial freedom I provided to systematically steal from me. As I approached the edge of their manicured property line, I stayed close to the tall privacy hedges, deliberately avoiding the sweeping line of sight of their front door smart camera. The sheer audacity of their deception tasted like bitter ash in my mouth. I slipped quietly through the side gate, my boots making virtually no sound on the damp paving stones. I bypassed the grand front entrance and made my way to the discreet side door that led directly into the spacious 3-car garage. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my heavy brass keyring. I smoothly selected the silver master key, a spare I had explicitly kept for major maintenance emergencies. I slid the key into the deadbolt. With a slow, highly practiced motion, I turned the lock. The well-oiled mechanism clicked open with barely a whisper. I gently pushed the heavy fireproof door open and stepped inside the cavernous garage. I stood in the center of the cold concrete floor for a few long seconds, allowing my eyes to fully adjust to the dim artificial light. The sprawling garage was a pristine, meticulously organized monument to their deeply unearned, highly excessive lifestyle. Monica's pristine white luxury SUV and Derek's expensive imported sports car sat gleaming under the overhead lights. Both vehicles had been purchased with funds I had generously provided under the guise of early inheritance gifts. I remembered writing the massive checks for those luxury vehicles, falsely believing I was genuinely helping them securely establish a completely stable life. Now those cars looked like pure trophies of theft. The air inside smelled faintly of expensive leather interior polish and premium motor oil. I closed the side door behind me, ensuring the latch caught silently. The house above me was not empty. Even through the thick, insulated ceiling of the garage, I could clearly hear the distinct, muffled sounds of active movement. Footsteps pacing rapidly across the hardwood floors, the sharp, heavy thud of large objects being dropped, and voices. I heard their voices echoing faintly through the ventilation ducts. I moved slowly toward the interior utility stairs, a narrow secondary staircase that led directly up to the back hallway near the sprawling master suite. I placed my hand on the wooden railing and began to climb. I placed my boots carefully on the very edge of each wooden step, expertly shifting my body weight to avoid making a single creak. I ascended into the residential level of the house, blending perfectly into the dark shadows of the narrow rear corridor. The sounds from the master bedroom became incredibly clear. They were not packing in a frantic, depressive panic. They were openly celebrating. I heard Monica let out a sharp, genuine burst of laughter, a joyful sound that directly contradicted the elaborate story of her severe clinical depression. I stood perfectly still in the protective darkness of the hallway, my back pressed firmly against the cool plastered wall. Through the partially open door of the master suite, I could see the bright morning light spilling across the imported Italian rugs. I could hear the distinct rhythmic zipping of heavily overstuffed luggage. They were dragging massive hard-shell designer suitcases across the floor, casually discussing which expensive formal outfits to bring for the exclusive captain's dinner. My chest burned with a profound, icy fury. There was absolutely no medical emergency. There was no desperate need for a quiet, healing family retreat. They were simply packing for a highly extravagant, incredibly expensive luxury vacation that they had ruthlessly stolen directly from my grieving hands. I held my breath, narrowing my focus, and silently listened as the true, horrifying depths of their sinister betrayal finally began to unfold right in front of me. I stood perfectly still in the protective darkness of the hallway. The master bedroom door was cracked open just enough to let a sliver of bright sunlight slice across the expensive hardwood floor. I could hear the distinct sound of a heavy suitcase zipper being aggressively pulled shut. Then came the voice of Monica. It was not the hushed, concerned whisper she had used on the phone with me just hours prior. It was loud, bright, and completely saturated with an ugly, arrogant triumph. She was actively mocking me. I could hear the sneer in her words as she imitated my calm acceptance of her demands. She laughed sharply, telling someone in the room how incredibly easy it had been to get the stupid old man to surrender a luxury vacation. She bragged about how she barely had to push before I rolled over and gave her exactly what she wanted. My jaw tightened. She was proudly describing my profound grief as a massive flaw to be mercilessly exploited for her own personal gain. Another voice joined the conversation, drawing a harsh, greedy laugh from Monica. It was Bradley, the perpetually unemployed brother of Monica, the man whose entire existence seemed strictly dedicated to avoiding any form of honest labor. He was lounging somewhere in the room, likely sitting on the very bed my money had purchased. He eagerly asked if they had the boarding passes fully printed. Then he loudly proclaimed that his primary goal for the entire 10-day Alaskan journey was to systematically drain the ship of its most expensive alcohol. He cheerfully reminded Monica to double-check that the onboard spending account was still solidly connected to my platinum credit card. He vividly described the premium bourbon and the highly exclusive champagne he planned to order every single night, joking that he would drink enough to put me in a shallow financial grave. He actually used those exact words. He was actively salivating over the prospect of bleeding my personal finances dry while sailing on a luxury vessel I had booked to honor the sacred memory of my deceased wife. The profound disrespect echoing through that room was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. As I listened to Bradley joyfully anticipating his stolen luxury, my mind involuntarily drifted back through the long, grueling decades of my life. I thought about the bitter, freezing rain of the early Seattle mornings in the late 1970s. I remembered waking up at 4 a.m, my entire body violently aching from the previous day of labor. I remembered tying my worn leather work boots in the dark, quietly slipping out of the house so I would not wake a sleeping Diane or a young innocent Derek. I spent 40 long years standing in knee-deep mud, aggressively pouring heavy concrete foundations and hauling massive steel beams until the physical cartilage in my lower spine was practically ground into dust. I permanently ruined my own back, sacrificing my own physical health for one single unwavering purpose. I wanted to ensure that my only son would absolutely never have to struggle the way I did. I wanted to build a massive, impenetrable financial fortress so Derek could securely live a beautiful life, completely free from the crushing anxiety of poverty. Diane and I had sacrificed every single personal luxury so that boy could have the world, and there he was. My son. The ultimate product of all that grueling sacrifice. He was standing in that bedroom, completely silent, while his deeply manipulative wife and her parasitic brother openly mocked the man who had given him absolutely everything. He was a coward, a weak, spineless shadow of a man who lacked the fundamental moral courage to defend his own father. But the truly devastating part, the moment that actively shifted this entire situation from a case of profound greed to something incredibly dark and deeply sinister, was about to happen. The loud sound of the luggage zipper stopped. The room fell relatively quiet for a few brief seconds. Then Derek finally spoke. His voice was completely devoid of any joy. It was tight, nervous, and heavily laced with a profound, cowardly hesitation. He did not ask them to stop making fun of me. Instead, he asked a question that made the blood freeze entirely solid within my veins. "Are you completely sure about the legal papers?" Monica, Derek asked. His tone was a pathetic, fearful whisper, but it carried perfectly into the dark hallway where I stood. I could clearly hear the nervous shuffling of his feet against the floorboards. I mean, doing this while we are out on the ocean, miles away from everything. It feels like a massive risk. We are talking about fundamentally altering his entire life. He is not actually losing his memory, Monica. We both know that. He just misses Mom. He is just sad. The absolute gravity of those specific words hit me like a runaway freight train. Legal papers, losing his memory. My breathing completely stopped. I stood frozen in the cold shadows, my hands slowly clenching into tight, rigid fists at my sides. Derek knew I was perfectly fine. He actively acknowledged that my mind was sharp, and that my only real affliction was the profound grief of losing his mother. Yet, he was questioning a legal strategy based on a completely fabricated medical premise. Monica did not offer him any comfort or any moral reassurance. She instantly snapped at him with a tone so incredibly vicious and sharply commanding that it made me physically recoil. She demanded to know if he was foolish enough to simply wait around until I inevitably decided to change my estate planning. She aggressively reminded him that I held the absolute legal power to alter the terms of the family trust at any given moment. She coldly asked him if he wanted to risk watching me leave the entire family fortune to a random charitable foundation out of spite. Then she loudly stated that her parents' own personal medical doctor had already officially signed the preliminary evaluation documents. She proudly declared that this highly corrupt, heavily compensated medical professional had explicitly put in writing that I was currently exhibiting severe, undeniable signs of advanced cognitive decline and early-onset Alzheimer's disease. The sheer, horrifying magnitude of their coordinated conspiracy crushed the last fragments of my paternal denial. The 3 recent bank withdrawals of $9,900 were not just for luxury shopping or paying off random consumer credit card debt. That cash was actively used to illegally bribe a medical doctor and quietly secure falsified psychiatric evaluations. They were not merely stealing a vacation. They were constructing a sophisticated, illegal medical trap to completely strip away my human rights, seize my financial assets, and forcibly lock me away in a facility against my will. I stood completely frozen in the dark corridor, my heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm of absolute, unforgiving war, as I finally realized with total, terrifying clarity that my own flesh and blood had just officially signed the irreversible legal paperwork for his own permanent and total financial destruction. The suffocating silence in the hallway was suddenly broken by Monica's venomous voice. She did not coddle my son's sudden burst of moral conscience. She actively attacked it. "Do you honestly want to wait around until your senile father casually decides to change his mind?" She hissed, her tone slicing the quiet air like a cold razor. "Do you want to patiently sit here until he rewrites his entire will and leaves every cent of his estate to some random charity out of pure spite?" "We have already paid for the legal groundwork, Derek. My parents' personal physician has already officially signed the preliminary medical evaluation. The paperwork clearly states that Harrison is actively showing severe, undeniable signs of advanced Alzheimer's disease." I stopped breathing. The floorboards beneath my boots felt as though they were giving way. Alzheimer's. The sheer terrifying weight of that specific word hung heavily in the air of the house I had purchased with my own blood and sweat. It was the most insidious, deeply cruel lie a person could possibly fabricate. My mind was incredibly sharp. I still actively managed my own complex investment portfolios and vividly remembered the exact day I poured the concrete foundation for the first commercial building of my career. Yet my own daughter-in-law was casually discussing a falsified medical diagnosis as if she were simply planning a weekend grocery shopping trip. Suddenly, a blinding flash of realization hit me. The banking alerts from earlier this morning. The 3 consecutive cash withdrawals of exactly $9,900 from our joint emergency checking account. I had initially suspected they were simply using the structured, untraceable cash to secretly purchase luxury goods or pay off hidden consumer debts. But the dark truth was exponentially worse. That heavily structured $30,000 in raw cash was specifically used to illegally bribe a deeply corrupt medical professional. They had brazenly used my own financial assets to quietly purchase a completely fraudulent psychiatric evaluation from a doctor embedded in the Sterling family network. The remaining cash was undoubtedly handed under the table to whatever completely unethical attorney they had hired to secretly draft the sinister legal documents without raising official red flags. They were successfully financing my own legal and medical execution using the very money I had painstakingly saved to protect my son from genuine hardship. Derek stammered, his voice vibrating with a pathetic, deeply sickening cowardice. "But what if the probate judge wants to actively question him, Monica? What if the court officially demands a secondary medical opinion from a totally independent neurologist? He is going to fight back. You know my dad. He never simply surrenders when he is backed into a corner." Monica let out a highly arrogant scoff that echoed chillingly down the narrow staircase. "He is not going to have the chance to fight back, Derek," she replied smoothly, her voice dripping with dark, malicious confidence. "That is exactly why we are leaving on this cruise tomorrow morning. While we are safely floating in the middle of the ocean, completely unreachable and totally removed from the situation, our attorney is going to officially file the petition for emergency guardianship with the county court. The judge will clearly see the signed medical affidavit from a licensed physician." I leaned my heavy shoulders against the cool plaster wall, closing my eyes and listening intensely as she carefully outlined the final, incredibly devastating phase of her highly illegal and totally unforgivable master plan. "And when the court predictably asks for a pattern of recent erratic behavior," Monica continued, her tone practically vibrating with smug, victorious pride, "we will simply present them with the undeniable fact that he deliberately abandoned his own highly expensive family vacation at the very last possible minute. We will convincingly argue that his mental state has rapidly deteriorated to the point where he is a severe danger to himself, suddenly isolating himself from his loving family and refusing to leave his empty house. It is the absolute perfect narrative. By the time our luxury cruise docks back here in Seattle next week, the emergency court order will already be fully processed. We will simply have the medical transport team quietly waiting at his front door. He will be safely transitioned into a secure memory care facility for his own good, and we will assume total immediate legal control over the entire revocable trust. This $2.2 million house The vast investment portfolios and all of his liquid cash accounts will finally officially belong to us. The sheer calculated perfection of their sinister trap was genuinely breathtaking. They had actively used my profound grief over Diane's passing to paint me as a deeply unstable, reclusive old man. They had cleverly manipulated me into voluntarily skipping the cruise, effectively transforming my quiet, dignified retreat into the final piece of manufactured evidence required to legally steal my fundamental human rights. If I had simply stayed home oblivious to their dark conversation, I would have woken up next week to the terrifying sight of medical orderlies forcing me out of my home and locking me away for the rest of my natural life. They were willing to legally bury me alive to accelerate their inheritance. My chest completely stopped hurting. The profound, suffocating sorrow that had heavily weighed down my tired heart since I first read Derek's text message at 6 a.m. completely evaporated into thin air. There was absolutely no trace of paternal love left inside my body. The man standing in that master bedroom was no longer my son. He was a dangerous, heavily compromised liability. He was an active, willing participant in a highly sophisticated, deeply malicious conspiracy, specifically designed to completely strip away my freedom, my dignity, and my hard-earned legacy. I simply did not need to ever hear another single word from them. I silently pushed myself away from the hallway wall, ensuring that the heavy fabric of my winter coat did not brush against the wooden doorframe. I placed my boots with absolute surgical precision on the exact edges of the wooden stairs, silently reversing my path down into the dim garage. My breathing was incredibly slow, remarkably deep, and entirely controlled. I felt a sudden massive surge of cold, highly focused energy completely flood my veins. It was the exact same intensely familiar feeling I used to get when I stepped onto a highly chaotic, heavily delayed commercial construction site and realized I had to ruthlessly fire the entire management crew and actively rebuild the failing structure from the absolute bare ground up. I slowly and silently slipped out the side door of the garage, feeling the cold morning wind immediately hit my face. I walked the 2 long blocks back to my parked truck, my strides incredibly long and completely purposeful. I quickly climbed into the driver's seat and firmly gripped the heavy leather steering wheel. The time for any silent, crippling grief was entirely over. They had officially declared war, and I was going to deliver a financial and legal slaughter so profoundly devastating that their precious Sterling family name would be permanently ruined. The drive back across the Interstate 90 floating bridge was a blur of gray concrete and driving rain. The heavy tires of my truck hummed a steady, monotonous rhythm against the wet asphalt, perfectly matching the cold, mechanical processing of my own thoughts. I did not drive back to my empty, silent house. I drove directly into the dense, towering heart of downtown Seattle. The towering glass and steel skyscrapers loomed overhead like massive, unforgiving sentinels as I navigated the slick, crowded streets. I pulled my truck into the subterranean parking garage of a sleek, high-rise office building, cut the engine, and took one final, incredibly deep breath. The raw, visceral sting of absolute betrayal had completely subsided, replaced entirely by a profound, terrifying clarity. I was no longer a grieving widower, and I was no longer a forgiving father. I was a man actively fighting for his own fundamental survival. I stepped out of the elevator on the 42nd floor and walked purposefully through the heavy glass doors of Reed Sterling and Vance, one of the most ruthless and highly respected corporate law firms in the entire Pacific Northwest. The receptionist, a sharply dressed young woman who had known me for over a decade, immediately recognized the hard, unyielding expression on my face. She did not bother asking if I had a scheduled appointment. She simply nodded quickly, picked up her desk phone, and quietly pressed a single button. Within seconds, the heavy mahogany door at the far end of the plush corridor swung open. Mitchell Reed stood in the doorway. Mitchell was a 68-year-old legal shark, a man whose tailored Italian suits barely concealed the predatory instincts of a highly aggressive courtroom brawler. He had been my personal attorney, my trusted confidant, and my closest friend for over 35 years. He was the man who had expertly drafted every single ironclad contract for my construction business, fiercely protecting my wealth from countless corporate predators. Mitchell took one look at my posture, stepped aside, and silently ushered me into his expansive corner office. He closed the heavy door behind us, ensuring the locking mechanism clicked firmly into place. The room was a monument to legal intimidation, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a sweeping panoramic view of the dark, churning waters of Puget Sound. He did not offer me a drink or ask me how my morning was going. He walked directly over to his massive oak desk, sat down in his high-backed leather chair, and fixed his piercing gray eyes directly on me. "You have that exact same look on your face that you had 20 years ago when you ruthlessly fired your entire executive board," Mitchell said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Tell me exactly who we are legally destroying today." I sat down in the leather chair opposite him. I did not waste time with emotional preludes or long, drawn-out explanations. I gave him the pure, unvarnished facts. I told him about the early morning text message from Derek canceling the cruise. I told him about the 3 consecutive bank withdrawals of exactly $9,900, carefully pulled from the emergency joint checking account. And finally, I told him about my silent trip to the Bellevue mansion. I repeated word for absolute word the horrifying conversation I had actively eavesdropped on between Monica and my son. I described their calculated plan to illegally purchase a fraudulent medical diagnosis of advanced Alzheimer's disease. I detailed their exact timeline to legally declare me totally incompetent and forcibly lock me away in a secure medical facility while they safely enjoyed a luxury vacation purchased with my own platinum credit card. Mitchell did not interrupt me once. He sat perfectly still, his hands steepled tightly together, his expression growing darker and significantly more dangerous with every single sentence I delivered. When I finally finished, a heavy, suffocating silence filled the expansive office. Mitchell slowly lowered his hands and let out a long, highly controlled breath. "I warned you about this, Harrison," he said, his tone devoid of any judgment, heavily laced instead with a cold, terrifying professional fury. 7 years ago, when you insisted on buying that incredibly expensive Bellevue property in cash and placing it into a revocable living trust for Derek to actively use, I explicitly warned you. I sat in this exact same chair, and I told you that putting massive, unrestricted assets into the hands of a weak young man with a highly manipulative wife was a recipe for absolute financial disaster. I told you they would eventually view your extraordinary generosity as a permanent weakness. "You were absolutely right, Mitchell," I replied evenly, not breaking eye contact. I foolishly let my profound grief over Diane blind my rational judgment. I desperately wanted to provide him with a beautiful, stress-free life. But I am not here to discuss my past parental failures. I am here because my own son and his terrible wife are actively trying to legally bury me alive. I need to know exactly how far along they are in this process. I need to know the specific mechanics of the execution they have planned for me." Mitchell did not say another word. He immediately swiveled his heavy leather chair toward his multi-monitor computer setup. His fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard with practiced, aggressive speed. As a highly senior partner in a massive law firm, Mitchell possessed specialized high-level access to the secure digital dockets of the county superior court system. He bypassed the public portals and dug directly into the restricted back-end filing networks, where local attorneys digitally queue up their forthcoming legal petitions before they are officially stamped by a sitting judge. The soft, rapid clicking of his keyboard was the only sound in the tense room for several agonizing minutes. I watched his eyes rapidly scan the dense lines of legal code flashing across his bright monitors. Suddenly, his fingers stopped moving. His jaw tightened significantly, and a dark, dangerous shadow passed entirely over his face. He reached out, grabbed his mouse, and clicked a single file. He slowly turned the large monitor around, so it directly faced me. The bright screen illuminated the dark room, casting a pale light over the mahogany desk. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto the stark, highly formal legal header clearly displayed at the very top of the digital document. It was an official petition for emergency guardianship and declaration of complete incapacity. The primary petitioner listed was Derek Caldwell. The targeted respondent was Harrison Caldwell. Mitchell pointed a sharp finger at the screen, his voice tight with barely suppressed anger. They did not just talk about it, Harrison. They actually paid a highly corrupt, completely unethical lawyer to draft the entire execution order. It is fully weaponized and actively sitting in the secure digital queue. Look at the attached exhibits. They have already uploaded a preliminary medical affidavit heavily implying severe advanced cognitive decline, intentionally signed by a physician completely outside of your normal medical network. They have documented your recent grief-induced isolation as undeniable proof of profound mental instability. And look at the scheduled filing date. He tapped the bottom of the screen. Next Tuesday. Exactly 48 hours after their massive luxury cruise ship officially sails completely out of international communication range. I stared at the glowing document, reading the cold, deeply clinical language designed to systematically strip away my basic human rights, seize my entire financial legacy, and forcibly erase me from the civilized world. They were going to quietly submit this massive, irreversible legal bomb to a sympathetic probate judge, while they were safely drinking premium champagne on a private ocean balcony I had personally paid for. They expected to return to Seattle, step off the ship, and casually inherit my vast fortune while I wasted away in a locked, sterile room. Mitchell turned the monitor back around and looked at me, his eyes burning with a fierce, protective fire. They have officially loaded the gun, Harrison, and they have actively pointed it directly at your head. If we do not completely dismantle this right now, you will absolutely lose your freedom before the week is over. They think they are dealing with a helpless old man. I slowly stood up from the leather chair, buttoning my heavy wool coat. I looked out the massive window at the dark, churning waters of the Sound. I felt absolutely nothing for the boy I had raised. The betrayal was complete, absolute, and utterly unforgivable. I turned back to my old friend, my voice a cold, chilling whisper of pure destruction. They are not dealing with a helpless old man, Mitchell. They are dealing with the architect who built their entire world. And today we are going to tear their miserable house down to the absolute studs. Show me exactly how we financially slaughter them. Mitchell leaned forward, resting his forearms heavily on the mahogany desk. The burning intensity in his eyes perfectly mirrored the cold fire surging through my veins. He offered absolutely no generic legal platitudes. Instead, he immediately shifted into the highly tactical mindset that made him the most feared trust attorney in the city. He explained that a direct emotional confrontation right now would be a massive strategic error. If I simply stormed into that Bellevue mansion and angrily demanded answers, Derek and Monica would instantly realize their sinister plot had been exposed. They would immediately contact their corrupt lawyer, scramble to hide their illicit financial trails, and potentially attempt to accelerate the guardianship petition using emergency psychiatric holds. We needed to operate with absolute, total secrecy. We were going to let them pack their designer luggage. We were going to let them board that luxurious cruise ship tomorrow morning, utterly convinced that their devastating trap was flawlessly set. And while they were completely isolated in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, sipping expensive champagne, on my dime we were going to systematically dismantle their entire financial existence. The very first step of our counteroffensive was addressing the massive Bellevue estate. When I originally purchased that $2.2 million property for Derek, I had legally structured the ownership through a revocable living trust. At the time, Derek and Monica had been mildly annoyed by the complex legal arrangement, foolishly assuming it was just a tedious administrative hurdle. They completely failed to comprehend the profound, absolute power that specific legal designation granted me. As the sole creator and primary grantor of a revocable trust, I held the absolute unquestionable authority to alter, amend, or completely dissolve the entire legal entity at any given moment. I did not need Derek's signature. I did not need Monica's permission. I did not even have a legal obligation to inform them that the status of their primary residence was being permanently altered. The house was essentially a very expensive, highly conditional gift that I could revoke the second they proved themselves unworthy. And they had just proven themselves to be actively dangerous. Mitchell pulled a thick stack of legal paper from his drawer and slid a gold pen across the wooden surface. He began rapidly drafting a formal notice of trust revocation. His sharp mind easily navigated the complex terminology required to immediately sever the property from the trust. The document explicitly stated that the original trust agreement was now officially null and void. The entire $2.2 million Bellevue property, along with all associated physical assets and underlying equity, was immediately reverting back to my sole individual name. I picked up the heavy gold pen and stared at the crisp white paper. For a brief fleeting second, the faint ghost of a memory crossed my mind. I remembered holding a much younger Derek on my shoulders, proudly showing him the freshly poured concrete foundation of his very first childhood home. But that innocent boy was entirely gone, completely replaced by a treacherous stranger who had actively conspired to lock me in a medical prison. I gripped the pen firmly and signed my full legal name with heavy, deliberate strokes. Mitchell immediately took the document, placed his official notary stamp on the bottom of the page, and pressed down with a loud final click. He quickly handed the paperwork to his senior paralegal, a stern, highly efficient woman who had silently entered the office. He explicitly instructed her to personally walk the documents down to the county recorder's office and file them before the afternoon deadline. With that single legally binding signature, Derek and Monica were officially stripped of their most valuable asset. They no longer resided in a luxurious multi-million-dollar family estate. They were now simply unauthorized occupants living in a house entirely owned by the man they were actively plotting to destroy. The financial slaughter was just beginning. We immediately moved on to the second phase of our counteroffensive, the joint emergency checking account. The very same account they had maliciously used to structure those highly illegal $30,000 cash withdrawals. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and placed it flat on the desk between us. I opened my secure mobile banking application and quickly navigated to the specific emergency ledger. The digital screen displayed a remaining available balance of just over $400,000. It was a massive sum of liquid cash that Diane and I had painstakingly accumulated over decades of hard physical labor. It was money meant to protect our family from genuine tragedies, not finance a corrupt medical conspiracy. Mitchell pulled his chair closer, his eyes fixed intently on the glowing digital screen. As my official legal counsel, he needed to physically witness the entire financial transaction to ensure there were absolutely no future claims of improper asset mismanagement. I tapped the transfer icon. I selected the joint emergency account as the primary source of the funds. Then I selected a completely private, deeply secure, solo account that I had maintained entirely separate from the family trust. I carefully typed the exact numerical value into the transfer window, every single penny. I did not leave them a single dollar for a rainy day. I did not leave them a single dime to cover their extravagant monthly utility bills or their premium automobile insurance premiums. I paused for one final second, my finger hovering directly over the bright green confirmation button. I visualized Monica laughing in that sunlit bedroom, openly mocking my grief. I pictured the corrupt doctor signing a fraudulent medical document designed to legally erase my freedom. And I pictured Derek, my own flesh and blood, cowardly validating the entire sinister operation. I pressed the button. The digital screen instantly refreshed. The joint emergency account balance dropped from over $400,000 down to zero. The massive life-altering sum of money was instantly and legally transferred into my impenetrable solo account. Mitchell leaned back in his leather chair, a look of profound professional satisfaction settling over his sharp features. He softly clapped his hands together, once the sharp sound echoing in the quiet room. "You have officially severed their primary financial lifeline, Harrison," he said, his voice calm and deeply measured. "The house is completely yours. The liquid cash is completely yours. By the time they officially board that ship tomorrow, they will be functioning on pure financial fumes without even realizing it. But we still have one final incredibly critical task to complete before they sail away. We must neutralize the pending court petition before their corrupt attorney can officially file it next Tuesday." I slowly picked up my phone and slipped it back into my coat pocket. The deep, heavy burning in my chest had been entirely replaced by an ocean of pure, freezing ice. I looked directly at Mitchell, my jaw set with absolute, unyielding determination. "We are not just going to neutralize their pathetic court petition, Mitchell. We are going to aggressively turn it completely around and use it to legally bury them. Tell me exactly what to do." I looked directly at Mitchell, my jaw set with absolute, unyielding determination. "We are not just going to neutralize their pathetic court petition, Mitchell. We are going to aggressively turn it completely around and use it to legally bury them. Tell me exactly what to do." Mitchell's eyes narrowed, a predatory gleam flashing in the cool gray light of the office. He leaned back, steepling his fingers once more. He began to explain the standard defensive maneuvers, suggesting we immediately file an emergency counter-injunction, preemptively alerting the court to their fraudulent medical documents. He proposed dragging them through years of grueling, highly expensive litigation until they were completely bankrupt. But I slowly shook my head. A long, drawn-out legal battle in a sterile courtroom was far too merciful for what they had planned for me. I did not want them to have the luxury of time, the ability to hire defense attorneys, or the comfort of sleeping in a warm bed while we fought. I wanted a total, instantaneous financial annihilation. I wanted them to return from their luxury cruise to find their entire universe fundamentally erased. "We are going to sell the Bellevue mansion," I stated flatly, the words dropping like heavy lead weights onto the polished desk. "Not next month. Not next week. We are going to sell it right now before they even have the chance to order their first premium cocktail on that ship." Mitchell blinked momentarily, taken aback by the sheer aggression of the pivot. He quickly recovered his legal mind, churning through the logistics. He reminded me that traditional real estate transactions take 30 to 60 days to properly close. They would return from their vacation long before the property officially changed hands. But I was simply not talking about a traditional, comfortable real estate transaction. I was talking about a ruthless corporate liquidation. During my 40 years as a commercial construction manager, I had crossed paths with every conceivable type of property investor in the greater Seattle area. I knew exactly who to call when a massive property needed to vanish from the ledger overnight. There is a very specific, highly lucrative subculture within the real estate market, dedicated entirely to corporate cash flippers. These are massive, heavily funded corporate investment groups that specialize in acquiring distressed or highly motivated properties at a steep discount. They completely bypass the traditional sluggish banking system. They buy properties sight unseen, utilizing deep reserves of liquid cash to close massive deals in a matter of days, completely skipping the extremely tedious appraisal and inspection contingencies. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and scrolled past Derek's treacherous contact profile. I stopped on a specific name I had not dialed in nearly a decade. Victor Rossi. Victor was a ruthless, highly efficient corporate real estate shark who ran the largest cash-flipping syndicate on the West Coast. He and I had done several highly profitable, extremely quiet deals back when I was liquidating old commercial warehouses. Victor only cared about two things in this world: speed and massive profit margins. I pressed the call button and placed the phone on speaker, resting it directly in the center of Mitchell's desk. The line rang twice before a sharp, gravelly voice answered. Harrison Caldwell. Victor boomed, his tone thick with genuine surprise. "I thought you officially retired and moved to a golf course. What does a retired construction kingpin need from a guy like me on a damp Thursday afternoon?" I need to liquidate a premium residential asset, Victor, I replied smoothly, my voice devoid of any casual pleasantries. And I need it done faster than you have ever closed a deal in your entire career. The casual warmth instantly vanished from Victor's voice, entirely replaced by the cold, calculating edge of a predator smelling blood in the water. Define your timeline, Harrison. What exactly are we looking at? I have a pristine, modern architectural estate sitting on a premium double lot in a highly exclusive Bellevue cul-de-sac. I stated my words crisp and entirely deliberate. The current market appraisal values the property at exactly $2.2 million. I hold the absolute unencumbered deed in my personal name. There are 0 liens, 0 outstanding mortgages, and absolutely no legal encumbrances. The legal title is perfectly clean. I paused, letting the immense value of the asset hang heavily in the air. I knew Victor was already mentally calculating the neighborhood comparables. I will sell you the entire estate for a flat 20% discount. I continued dropping the massive financial bait. $1.76 million cash. But I have 2 absolute non-negotiable conditions. First, we fully close the transaction and officially record the deed transfer in exactly 3 days. No standard inspections, no lengthy appraisals, no financing delays. Pure liquid cash wired directly into my attorney's escrow account by Monday morning. I heard a low whistle through the phone speaker. A flat 20% discount on a pristine Bellevue mansion was an incredibly rare, deeply lucrative margin for a cash flipper. Victor simply did not hesitate. If the title is as clean as you say it is, Harrison, I can have my corporate attorneys wire the entire sum by Monday at 9 in the morning. What is the second condition? This was the crucial, profoundly devastating strike. This was the exact mechanism that would completely obliterate Derek and Monica's comfortable reality. The property must be purchased strictly as is, Victor, I said, my voice dropping to a low, chilling register. And when I say as is, I am specifically referring to the absolute entirety of its current physical contents. Every single piece of custom imported furniture, every expensive television, every single designer dress hanging in the walk-in closets, every piece of expensive jewelry left in the drawers, and every single digital device scattered across the counters. You buy the house and you take absolute legal ownership of everything currently existing inside those walls. I want your aggressive clean-out crews waiting in the driveway on Tuesday morning. I want them to haul absolutely everything left inside that house directly into an industrial dumpster. You keep what you want to sell, and you physically destroy the rest. A heavy silence fell over the speakerphone. Even a hardened, ruthless liquidator like Victor was momentarily stunned by the sheer unadulterated aggression of the demand. But business was business, and the profit margin was undeniable. You are a terrifying man when you are highly motivated, Harrison. Victor finally replied, a dark chuckle vibrating through the audio connection. You have yourself a deal. Send the legal address and the title documents to my acquisition team. We will begin drafting the binding purchase agreement immediately. I firmly terminated the active call and slowly looked directly at Mitchell across the polished wooden desk. My highly seasoned attorney simply stared back at me with an expression of profound, deeply respectful awe. He silently acknowledged the absolute brilliance of the maneuver. The intricate financial trap was securely set in motion. We were now perfectly ready for their complete legal destruction. Mitchell leaned back in his heavy leather chair and offered a low whistle of genuine admiration. The sheer audacity of liquidating a multi-million-dollar estate in 72 hours to a corporate flipping syndicate was an absolute masterstroke. I thanked my old friend for his rapid legal execution, stood up and firmly shook his hand. We had successfully initiated the complete demolition of their primary financial foundation, but the true psychological warfare was just about to begin. I walked out of the towering downtown office building and stepped back onto the wet Seattle pavement. The heavy rain had finally stopped, leaving the gray city streets slick and reflective under the afternoon sky. I climbed into the familiar cabin of my truck, completely ignoring the damp chill seeping through my wool coat. I placed my hands on the steering wheel, taking a moment to fully process the incredibly satisfying reality of what we had just accomplished. Derek and Monica were currently spending their afternoon packing their expensive designer luggage, entirely convinced that they had flawlessly outsmarted a grieving, helpless old man. They believed their malicious legal petition was safely secured and ready to strip away my entire existence. They were gleefully preparing to embark on a massive luxury cruise that I had painstakingly organized and fully funded. They thought I was sitting at home weeping over old photographs and slowly losing my mind. Instead, I was actively dismantling the very fabric of their comfortable, unearned lives. However, simply taking the house and the emergency cash was not entirely sufficient. I wanted them to deeply, viscerally feel the profound consequences of their arrogance. I wanted them to experience the exact same terrifying helplessness they had so casually planned to inflict upon me. I did not want them to simply find out they were homeless and broke while standing comfortably in their local driveway. I wanted them entirely trapped. I wanted them completely isolated in international waters, surrounded by opulent luxury that they suddenly could not afford to touch. I reached into my pocket, retrieved my smartphone, and opened the contacts list. I bypassed my personal network and navigated directly to the saved reservation file for our upcoming Alaskan voyage. I tapped the primary customer service number for the Royal Caribbean Executive Booking Desk. The call connected instantly, routing me through a brief automated menu before placing me on a very short hold. A cheerful, highly professional voice answered the line, greeting me by name and enthusiastically thanking me for my premium loyalty status. The representative asked how she could assist me with my upcoming embarkation for the owner's suite. I kept my voice perfectly smooth and entirely calm, betraying absolutely none of the cold fury burning in my chest. I provided my secure booking reference number, my personal identification details, and the primary billing zip code to fully verify my authorized status on the account. She efficiently confirmed my identity and cheerfully asked if I needed to arrange any last-minute shore excursions or perhaps upgrade our premium dining packages. I politely declined her offers. I told her that I needed to make a highly specific, immediate administrative adjustment to the primary passenger folio. I explained that a sudden, unavoidable personal matter had unfortunately arisen, and I would absolutely not be boarding the vessel tomorrow morning. The representative offered her immediate, practiced condolences, assuming that I wanted to completely cancel the entire reservation and initiate the standard refund protocol. She began explaining the late cancellation penalties, but I quickly and firmly interrupted her routine speech. I clarified my exact intentions. I explicitly stated that I was not canceling the physical cruise tickets. The remaining passengers listed on the primary folio, Derek Caldwell, Monica Caldwell, and Bradley Sterling, were absolutely still planning to board the ship and embark on the scheduled Alaskan itinerary. I wanted their physical boarding passes to remain completely active and entirely valid. The representative paused, mildly confused by the unusual request, but quickly confirmed that the secondary passengers could absolutely proceed with the vacation without my physical presence. That was exactly what I needed to hear. Then I delivered the final, devastating blow. I instructed her to immediately and permanently remove my primary platinum credit card from the central onboard spending account. I explained that I was completely severing all financial responsibility for the remaining passengers. I demanded that my card be entirely unlinked from their individual cabin keys, their digital folios, and any associated onboard credit lines. The representative fell silent for a brief moment, likely reading the extensive list of premium beverage packages, luxury spa appointments, and expensive specialty dining reservations that were already linked to that specific credit card. She carefully informed me that doing so would immediately void all of those specific premium arrangements. I told her that was precisely my intention. I firmly reiterated that Derek, Monica, and Bradley were now fully responsible for providing their own independent method of payment upon arrival at the embarkation terminal. If they wanted to consume premium alcohol access, the high-speed satellite internet, or participate in any exclusive shore excursions, they would have to physically present their own credit cards to the ship purser. I waited patiently on the line as she typed rapidly on her keyboard, officially executing my exact commands. She read a formal disclosure statement confirming that my financial liability was officially terminated and that the remaining passengers would be presented with a zero-balance folio upon boarding. I thanked her for her highly efficient assistance and promptly ended the call. I placed the phone down on the passenger seat of my truck, a cold, undeniable smirk finally breaking across my face. The trap was now entirely complete. The snare had been flawlessly set, and the bait was simply too magnificent for them to ever refuse. They were going to wake up tomorrow morning, load their massive, overstuffed designer suitcases into a premium rideshare vehicle, and eagerly head down to the bustling Seattle cruise terminal. They would successfully scan their active boarding passes, walk onto that massive floating palace, and immediately head straight for the nearest premium luxury bar to celebrate their perceived victory. Bradley would confidently order the most expensive vintage bourbon available. Monica would loudly request a bottle of exclusive imported champagne, and Derek would smugly hand the bartender his digital cabin card, completely expecting my unlimited platinum account to smoothly absorb the massive financial impact. The absolute humiliation they were about to experience when that card was brutally declined would be genuinely magnificent. They would be standing in the middle of a crowded luxury lounge, cut off from my wealth, forced to desperately empty their own highly depleted bank accounts just to secure a basic internet connection. They would be physically trapped on a massive ship in the middle of the freezing ocean for 10 long, agonizing days, slowly realizing that their unlimited financial gravy train had completely derailed. And while they were desperately trying to figure out how to pay for their own extravagant bar tab, Victor Rossi and his aggressive corporate demolition crew would be violently throwing their entire pretentious lifestyle into a rusted steel dumpster. I smiled. The next morning arrived with the crisp, damp chill that perfectly defined early spring in the Pacific Northwest. I had been awake long before dawn, nursing a black coffee in my kitchen, methodically reviewing the timeline. By 8 o'clock, I was parked in an elevated viewing lot overlooking the bustling cruise terminal at the port of Seattle. The massive, brilliant white hull of the luxury ocean liner dominated the waterfront, preparing to cast off for Alaska. The terminal was a hive of chaotic activity. Fleets of taxis and shuttle buses constantly pulled up to the unloading zones, discharging hundreds of eager passengers. I sat comfortably in my truck, a pair of compact field binoculars resting on the console. I did not need them yet. I knew exactly what time they would arrive. Derek was aggressively punctual when it came to securing his own pleasure. Right on schedule, a premium black sport utility vehicle glided smoothly up to the designated VIP drop-off lane. The driver stepped out and quickly opened the rear doors. My heart beat with a slow, mechanical rhythm as I watched Derek step onto the concrete. He was dressed in expensive nautical resort wear, looking entirely relaxed and completely carefree. Monica followed closely behind him, her face hidden behind oversized designer sunglasses, dramatically gesturing for the driver to handle her massive array of luggage. Then came Bradley, bouncing out of the vehicle, wearing a brightly colored tropical shirt that looked profoundly ridiculous in the cold Seattle wind. They stood together on the pavement, laughing loudly, completely enveloped in their unearned arrogance. They handed their bags to the eager porters, expecting my premium loyalty status to smooth every single step of their VIP embarkation process. I picked up my digital tablet from the passenger seat and opened the primary social media application. I had created an anonymous profile months ago to keep track of family updates Derek routinely forgot to share. I navigated directly to Monica's public feed. She had just posted a fresh, highly filtered photograph of the three of them standing proudly in front of the massive ship. The caption beneath the image read, "Embarking on our much-needed, incredibly hard-earned luxury vacation. Time to leave all the stress behind and completely pamper ourselves." A champagne glass emoji punctuated the absurd statement. Incredibly hard-earned. The sheer delusion required to type those words after financing a corrupt medical trap with stolen cash was staggering. They genuinely believed they had successfully outmaneuvered me. They firmly believed the most difficult part of their sinister plan was already behind them, completely unaware that they were actively walking directly into a flawless, inescapable financial cage. I watched through the windshield as they casually strolled through the heavy glass doors of the main terminal building, disappearing into the VIP security queue. They would be fast-tracked directly onto the ship, bypassing the long lines of ordinary passengers. I knew the exact layout of that vessel. I knew they would head straight to the exclusive upper decks, eagerly anticipating their premium welcome packages. I sat in my truck for another 2 hours, patiently watching the endless stream of passengers board the ship. The massive loading ramps were eventually pulled back. The heavy mooring lines were systematically detached from the concrete pylons. A deep, powerful vibration resonated through the damp air, vibrating against the windows of my truck as the ship's massive engines fired to life. Then the incredibly loud, booming blast of the ship's main horn echoed across the waterfront. It was a triumphant, declarative sound. The colossal white vessel slowly and smoothly began to pull away from the dock, churning the dark waters of Puget Sound into thick, white foam. I watched the ship gracefully rotate and point its massive bow directly toward the open ocean. They were finally on their way. Within a few short hours, they would completely lose all standard terrestrial cellular service. They would be fully reliant on the ship's exorbitant satellite internet connection, a premium service that they no longer had the financial means to seamlessly access. They were entirely isolated, perfectly suspended in international waters, completely cut off from their corrupt attorneys and their heavily mortgaged reality back on solid ground. I put the heavy truck in gear and drove away from the waterfront, heading straight back to the downtown financial district. Mitchell Reed was already waiting for me in the executive boardroom of his law firm. Seated across from him was Victor Rossi, flanked by 2 of his own aggressive corporate attorneys. The atmosphere in the room was strictly coldly business. There were no pleasantries, no casual conversations about the weather. We were there to execute a highly lucrative, profoundly devastating corporate liquidation. Victor had a thick stack of finalized closing documents neatly arranged on the polished mahogany table. His legal team had thoroughly verified the completely unencumbered status of the Bellevue estate. They knew they were securing an incredibly valuable asset at a massive 20% discount, and they were more than eager to finalize the transaction before I could possibly change my mind. I sat down at the table and picked up the heavy gold-plated pen that Mitchell explicitly provided for the occasion. I carefully read through the binding clauses. The language was exceptionally clear and entirely unforgiving. The sale was strictly and undeniably as is. The buyer assumed absolute total ownership of the physical property and the complete entirety of its current contents. Victor's highly aggressive demolition crews were officially authorized to physically breach the property and commence total physical liquidation at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I placed the tip of the pen on the thick paper and signed my legal name on the final signature line. I pushed the executed documents across the table to Victor. He reviewed the signatures, nodded sharply to his lead attorney, and smoothly pulled a secure digital authentication token from his jacket pocket. Victor rapidly keyed a numerical sequence into the token, authorizing the immediate release of the massive funds. We sat in absolute silence and waited. Less than 3 minutes later, my personal smartphone illuminated on the table. It was a highly secure automated priority alert from my primary banking institution. I picked up the device and opened the encrypted message. The notification was incredibly brief, beautifully simple, and profoundly absolute. An incoming federal wire transfer of $1.76 million had successfully cleared and was now permanently settled into my private, impenetrable solo account. The money was fully secured. The transaction was completely irreversible. Victor stood up firmly, shook my hand, and briskly walked out of the room with his legal team to immediately dispatch his property extraction crews. I stood completely alone in the silent boardroom, with Mitchell. The massive Bellevue mansion, the physical manifestation of all their arrogant pride, absolutely no longer belonged to my son. Their expensive cars, their designer wardrobes, and every single piece of furniture they had ever owned were about to be violently tossed into a commercial dumpster. The financial slaughter was flawlessly executed, and my treacherous son was completely and entirely trapped on a floating island, now absolutely powerless to stop it. I sat in the quiet comfort of my living room, the glowing embers of the fireplace casting a warm, flickering light across the hardwood floor. A steaming cup of black coffee rested on the table beside me. The house was entirely silent, completely devoid of the suffocating grief that had plagued me just a few days prior. Hundreds of miles away, completely swallowed by the vast, freezing expanse of the northern Pacific Ocean, my son and his treacherous wife were currently experiencing the absolute, undeniable reality of their actions. The luxury cruise industry operates on a very specific, entirely cashless financial model. The moment a passenger steps onto the deck of the vessel, physical currency becomes completely useless. Every single transaction, from premium dining and luxury spa treatments to satellite internet and top-tier alcohol, is exclusively processed through a digital cabin key, commonly known as a CPass card. That plastic card must be securely backed by a valid, active credit account. I had completely severed that crucial financial lifeline. I knew it would take a few hours for the ship to hit international waters and update its internal billing network. Right on schedule, my smartphone began to vibrate on the coffee table. Because they were entirely cut off from standard cellular towers, they had to rely on the ship's highly restricted, incredibly weak emergency satellite network to make outgoing calls. The connection was terrible, heavily laced with crackling static, but the frantic, desperate audio messages they left on my secure voicemail system were remarkably clear in their absolute panic. I took a slow sip of my coffee, leaned back in my leather armchair, and tapped the screen to play the very first recorded message. Derek's voice echoed into the quiet room. He did not sound like the smug, calculating man who had confidently signed legal documents to steal my freedom. He sounded completely terrified, his breath coming in short, rapid gasps. He frantically explained that a massive, highly embarrassing misunderstanding had just occurred at the primary luxury lounge. Monica had proudly marched up to the premium bar, flanked by her entire arrogant family, and loudly ordered a $500 bottle of exclusive vintage champagne to properly celebrate the beginning of their opulent vacation. The bartender had smoothly taken her digital cabin card, swiped it through the terminal, and promptly informed her that the transaction was entirely declined. Derek stammered through the voicemail, vividly describing the sheer, excruciating humiliation of that specific moment. Monica had aggressively argued with the bartender, causing a massive, incredibly loud scene in front of dozens of wealthy passengers. She demanded that the staff run the card again, arrogantly proclaiming that the account was backed by a limitless platinum credit limit. The bartender tried multiple times, finally escalating the issue to the head purser, who coldly informed them that the primary funding source had been explicitly and permanently revoked by the account holder. Derek practically begged me to call the cruise line and fix what he assumed was a simple administrative banking error. He pleaded that Monica's parents were completely furious and intensely embarrassed by the public spectacle. I let the first voicemail end and smoothly tapped the screen to play the second message. This recording had been left exactly 40 minutes later. The initial confusion in Derek's voice had completely dissolved, entirely replaced by a raw, unadulterated, suffocating panic. He had marched directly down to the guest services desk to purchase a premium satellite internet package so he could access his mobile banking application and quickly transfer funds to save face. The premium internet connection cost exactly $100 per day. Derek had confidently handed the purser his physical debit card, the one directly tied to our joint emergency checking account. The very same account they had used to illegally bribe a corrupt medical doctor. He told me, his voice cracking with absolute desperation, that the debit card was completely declined due to severely insufficient funds. He was entirely frantic, loudly demanding to know how a secure bank account with over $400,000 in liquid cash could possibly be reading a stark, undeniable zero balance. He begged me to answer the phone. He pleaded with me to contact the financial institution and report a massive, catastrophic bank fraud. He actually had the sheer, unmitigated audacity to ask me to protect the very money he had systematically planned to use for my permanent legal destruction. I listened to his pathetic, cracking voice and felt an overwhelming wave of cold, calculating satisfaction. They were finally beginning to understand the full terrifying scope of their bleak situation. They were physically trapped inside a massive floating metal box in the middle of a freezing ocean. They had absolutely no active credit cards, zero accessible cash, and absolutely no way to generate any liquid funds. The third and final voicemail was the most revealing. It was not Derek. It was Monica. The thick, arrogant superiority she had displayed in the Bellevue mansion was completely gone. She was practically weeping into the receiver. She sobbed about how her entire family was mercilessly turning against her. Bradley, her parasitic brother, was throwing a massive explosive tantrum in the hallway because he could not order a single drop of alcohol. He had excitedly marched up to the poolside bar to begin his 10-day binge, only to be brutally informed that his cabin card was financially locked. Monica cried that they had been officially barred from entering all the premium specialty dining restaurants on the ship. Because they possessed absolutely no valid payment methods, they were now strictly relegated to the massive crowded, complimentary buffet lines along with the thousands of ordinary economy passengers they constantly mocked. She wailed about the sheer indignity of having to stand in a long line just to get a basic plate of free pasta. She vividly described the burning judgmental glares from her wealthy parents, who had completely expected a flawless, highly pampered luxury experience on my dime. Instead, her parents were currently trapped in a tiny standard economy cabin, furious that their premium reservations had been totally voided. Monica begged me to fix the accounts, promising to apologize for whatever minor slight she had supposedly committed. She still genuinely believed this was just a petty temporary punishment for a minor disagreement. She had absolutely no idea that while she was crying over a declined bottle of expensive champagne and a ruined dinner reservation, my real estate contacts were actively finalizing the complete total demolition of her entire life back on dry land. I slowly deleted all 3 voicemails permanently, erasing their desperate begging voices from my secure digital server. I placed my smartphone back onto the solid wooden table and took another slow, deeply satisfying sip of my hot coffee. Let them eat from the free buffet line. Let them suffer the brutal, unyielding fury of her humiliated, arrogant family. Let them spend the next 10 days trapped on a massive boat, slowly descending into complete and total financial madness. They absolutely deserved every single agonizing second of this beautiful, flawless nautical nightmare. Their precious vacation had officially become a floating prison. The following morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the heavy gray skies that had mirrored my initial grief just days prior. The crisp air felt invigorating as I drove my truck across the bridge toward the affluent, manicured neighborhoods of Bellevue. I parked my vehicle down the street from the estate that no longer belonged to my treacherous son. I walked to a coffee shop on the corner, purchased a black roast, and strolled back toward the property. I positioned myself comfortably on the public sidewalk, directly across the quiet, tree-lined street. The neighborhood was serene, filled with the quiet hum of automated sprinklers and distant landscaping crews. It was a picture of suburban tranquility, oblivious to the corporate liquidation that was about to violently unfold. I stood there, wrapping my cold hands around the warm paper cup, staring at the architectural facade of the house I had purchased with parental intentions. At exactly 7:45 in the morning, the heavy sound of diesel engines shattered the quiet neighborhood peace. 2 enormous roll-off dumpsters were backed down the wide, stamped concrete driveway. The heavy steel wheels gouged deep, unceremonious tracks into the pristine landscaping Monica had arrogantly demanded I finance just last spring. Behind the dumpsters, 3 large box trucks pulled up to the curb. A crew of 12 burly, highly efficient men in work boots poured out of the vehicles. Victor Rossi had absolutely kept his word. These were hardened property extraction specialists accustomed to corporate liquidations. They operated with a cold precision that was entirely terrifying to witness. The crew foreman, a massive man holding a heavy steel pry bar and a clipboard, marched directly up to the custom front door. He did not attempt to pick the expensive smart lock. He simply jammed the steel bar into the doorframe and wrenched it backward, shattering the locking mechanism with a loud crack. The heavy wooden door swung open, exposing the pristine interior of Derek and Monica's stolen sanctuary. The financial slaughter commenced instantly. The workers flooded into the wide, sunlit foyer like an organized army of relentless locusts. Within minutes, the massive front doors were permanently wedged open, and the physical eradication of their entire pretentious lifestyle began in earnest. 2 burly workers emerged from the front door carrying Monica's prized, custom-ordered Italian velvet sofas. I remembered the exact day she purchased them. She had casually handed the elite interior designer my platinum credit card, without a single moment of hesitation, racking up tens of thousands of dollars in a single afternoon, while claiming she simply needed the living room to properly reflect her elevated social status. I watched with profound satisfaction as the workers carelessly dragged the incredibly expensive white velvet across the rough concrete porch. They hoisted the sofas over the rusted steel rim and let them violently crash into the empty metal bin. The delicate, imported fabric instantly tore against the sharp edges of the rusted container, completely ruining the massive investment in less than 5 seconds. The relentless parade of destruction continued without a single pause. Another group of workers began violently hurling massive black garbage bags out of the second-story master bedroom window, aiming directly for the open dumpster below. The bags were overflowing with Monica's incredibly expensive, meticulously curated designer wardrobe. Hundreds of silk dresses, premium leather handbags, and imported European shoes cascaded down into the filthy metal bin like common household trash. She had eagerly planned exactly which luxury resort outfits she would proudly wear on the cruise ship deck, blissfully unaware that her entire material existence was currently being tossed into a garbage heap. Then came Derek's prized possessions. A worker casually walked out of the garage carrying 2 heavy premium leather golf bags filled with custom-fitted, incredibly expensive titanium clubs. Derek had insisted he needed the professional-grade equipment to properly network with wealthy executives. The worker grabbed those bags by their premium leather straps, swung them heavily through the air, and aggressively hurled them over the high steel wall of the dumpster. The incredibly satisfying sound of bending titanium shafts and snapping carbon fiber echoed loudly across the quiet suburban street. I took another slow, deeply rewarding sip of my hot coffee as a separate team of specialized workers arrived in a small utility van. They completely ignored the massive volume of furniture being violently thrown away and walked directly up to the front entrance. They carried heavy drills, fresh brass hardware, and thick metal strike plates. Victor Rossi was officially securing his newly acquired asset. The workers aggressively stripped away the broken electronic smart locks that Monica had previously programmed with her personal security codes. They installed heavy commercial-grade deadbolts on every single exterior door of the massive estate. The physical manifestation of their total exclusion was incredibly powerful to witness. Even if Derek and Monica miraculously managed to escape their floating nautical prison and somehow secure a ride back to this specific neighborhood, they would find absolutely nothing waiting for them. Their custom digital access codes were permanently erased. Their physical keys were entirely useless. They were now completely locked out of the exact same property they had once arrogantly claimed as their undeniable birthright. For 3 solid, highly chaotic hours, the aggressive extraction crew ruthlessly gutted the entire $2.2 million property. They systematically stripped away every single television, every piece of expensive modern artwork, every custom-imported rug, and every single digital device left carelessly resting on the granite kitchen counters. The massive steel dumpsters quickly filled to the absolute brim with the shattered, ruined remnants of their completely unearned, highly pretentious lifestyle. Not a single photograph, not a single piece of expensive jewelry, not a single pair of designer sunglasses was spared from the violent, unyielding corporate liquidation. Everything they owned, everything they had arrogantly purchased with my stolen wealth, was brutally treated as entirely abandoned, worthless trash. When the massive job was finally completed, the crew foreman loudly blew a sharp whistle. The workers rapidly climbed back into their unmarked vehicles. A hydraulic diesel truck backed up to the driveway, secured the massive steel dumpsters, and slowly hauled them away toward the municipal landfill. The quiet, affluent neighborhood slowly returned to its pristine, serene state, entirely unbothered by the absolute devastation that had just occurred on that specific premium lot. I stood on the sidewalk for several more minutes, simply staring at the completely empty, thoroughly secured house. The massive front windows, previously framed by expensive silk curtains, now revealed nothing but bare, hollow, echoing rooms. The total physical eradication of Derek and Monica Caldwell was officially complete. They had absolutely no home to return to, zero physical possessions to their name, and completely empty bank accounts. They were currently trapped in the middle of a freezing ocean, hopelessly drowning in a profound, inescapable financial nightmare of their own incredibly arrogant design. I slowly crushed the empty paper coffee cup in my right hand, turned away from the empty, soulless estate, and calmly walked back toward my waiting truck, feeling an overwhelming, absolute sense of profound, permanent, and undeniable peace. 10 days is a remarkably brief period of time in the grand scheme of an entire human life, but when you are trapped in a floating metallic cage of your own financial ruin, 10 days can easily stretch into an absolute, agonizing eternity. I did not need to physically stand at the Seattle port to know exactly how the miserable disembarkation process was unfolding. My private investigator, Robert Sanchez, had discreetly positioned himself near the main terminal doors, providing me with highly detailed, real-time audio updates from a secure distance. The colossal white ocean liner slowly drifted back to the dock under a heavy, overcast morning sky. But there was absolutely no joy radiating from the returning passengers I was currently tracking. While thousands of sunburnt, happily exhausted travelers eagerly streamed down the primary gangways, my treacherous son and his parasitic in-laws were severely delayed. They were forcefully detained at the central guest services desk for nearly 2 hours, fiercely arguing with the ship's purser over their massive, entirely unpaid onboard gratuities and mandatory service charges. Because my platinum card had been permanently revoked and their personal debit accounts were completely drained, they were utterly incapable of settling their final digital folios. Robert quietly reported that Monica looked completely unrecognizable. Her perfectly manicured, highly curated socialite facade had completely shattered. She was wearing the exact same wrinkled designer sweatpants she had boarded the ship, with her face pale, her hair tied in a messy, chaotic knot. Her parents, who had proudly expected to be treated like nautical royalty, were radiating a toxic, furious silence. They completely refused to even look at Derek. Bradley, suffering from 10 solid days of enforced involuntary sobriety, was nervously pacing near the terminal exit, shivering in the damp Seattle wind. They had spent the entire luxury vacation isolated in their windowless cabins, eating complimentary buffet food, intensely fighting over who was ultimately responsible for the catastrophic banking error. They were entirely convinced that a massive automated fraud alert had temporarily frozen their assets. They genuinely believed that the moment they stepped off the ship and found a stable cellular signal, a quick, aggressive phone call to the bank would instantly restore their unearned wealth. They desperately pooled the absolute last remnants of their physical currency. Between the 5 of them, they managed to scrape together just over $80 in loose, crumpled bills. It was barely enough to secure a single standard economy taxi van for the long drive back to the affluent suburbs. Robert watched from a distance as they awkwardly and aggressively shoved their massive, heavy designer suitcases into the back of the scuffed yellow vehicle. They were packed into the back seats like miserable sardines, their knees pressed tightly together, the thick, heavy tension inside the cabin completely suffocating them all. Derek, desperately trying to salvage whatever remaining shred of masculine authority he still possessed, loudly promised his furious father-in-law that everything would be completely resolved within the hour. He loudly declared that the banking issue was a simple clerical mistake, and he fiercely vowed to drive straight to the local courthouse the very following morning. He aggressively promised to immediately file the emergency guardianship petition, fully legally declare his father entirely incompetent, and finally seize permanent control of the entire family fortune. He was eagerly planning my complete legal execution from the cramped back seat of a foul-smelling, terribly maintained commercial taxi. The yellow van merged onto the busy interstate, carefully navigating the heavy morning traffic toward the affluent, highly manicured neighborhoods of Bellevue. The ride took nearly 45 minutes. Every single mile brought them closer to the ultimate, devastating reality check of their utterly miserable lives. I was comfortably seated in Mitchell Reed's towering downtown office, quietly listening to the live audio feed as the taxi finally turned into their exclusive, beautifully tree-lined residential neighborhood. The quiet, serene streets looked exactly as they always did right up until the taxi slowly rolled to a stop in front of the familiar premium double lot. The sudden, deafening silence inside that taxi must have been absolutely magnificent to experience firsthand. The beautiful property they had so proudly called their own was completely transformed beyond all possible recognition. It no longer looked like a pristine multi-million-dollar residential sanctuary. It looked like a highly aggressive, incredibly active commercial construction zone. Victor Rossi had wasted absolutely no time maximizing his brand-new investment. The beautifully manicured green lawn, which Monica had previously obsessed over with intense ferocity, was deeply scarred by massive, heavy diesel tire tracks. A massive, bright red commercial real estate sign was driven deeply into the soft front yard, boldly displaying the word "sold" in huge, undeniable white letters. The elegant, custom-crafted front doors had been completely removed, entirely replaced by heavy temporary sheets of raw plywood, securely fastened with thick steel chains and massive commercial padlocks. Several of the large bay windows on the lower level were heavily covered in thick plastic sheeting, actively being prepped for rapid, highly intrusive corporate remodeling. The massive house was entirely dark, completely hollow, and utterly devoid of all previous domestic life. But the true, absolute horror of their newly discovered situation was waiting for them directly on the damp concrete curb. Robert quietly narrated the chaotic scene as Derek and Monica slowly stumbled out of the yellow taxi, their mouths hanging wide open, in sheer, unadulterated, mind-numbing shock. They stood completely paralyzed on the public sidewalk, blankly staring at the exact spot where their municipal trash bins were normally placed on collection day. There, carelessly stacked in a massive, incredibly chaotic pile, were dozens of heavy black industrial garbage bags. The plastic bags were violently ripping at the seams, fully exposing the ruined, discarded remnants of their entire pretentious, heavily financed lifestyle. A crushed, severely bent titanium golf club violently protruded sharply from one of the overstuffed bags. A highly expensive, carefully imported designer silk dress loosely spilled out of another, completely soaked by the damp, dirty morning pavement. Victor's highly aggressive demolition crew had ruthlessly followed my exact, unrelenting instructions to the absolute letter. They had rapidly cleared the sprawling house entirely down to the bare wooden studs, violently tearing out every single material item that Derek and Monica had ever proudly owned. And sitting directly on top of the massive pile of discarded, completely ruined designer merchandise was a large hand-painted cardboard sign, hastily written in thick, black, permanent markers by one of the anonymous demolition workers. The rough sign simply read, "Free to take." Derek blindly dropped his expensive leather travel bag directly onto the wet sidewalk. He took 2 shaky steps toward the garbage, his mind completely incapable of processing the magnitude of the visual information in front of him. Monica finally let out a guttural scream, a sound of pure despair that echoed down the quiet street. Her furious parents stood silently behind the idling taxi, absolutely disgusted. They finally realized their precious son-in-law was a completely broke, entirely homeless fraud who had just been systematically eradicated by the very man he had tried to destroy. While Robert quietly relayed the glorious details of that curbside meltdown through my earpiece, I was nowhere near the Bellevue area. I was comfortably seated in a plush leather armchair inside the highly exclusive first-class lounge at the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The ambient noise of the terminal was completely muted behind thick glass windows. I was sipping a perfectly brewed espresso, watching massive commercial jetliners slowly taxi across the wet tarmac. The sheer contrast between my serene, luxurious environment and the absolute chaotic devastation unfolding on that damp suburban sidewalk was incredibly satisfying. I had booked a premium flight to a quiet, sun-drenched island in the Caribbean, deciding that I truly deserved a genuine, profoundly relaxing vacation after meticulously dismantling the treacherous lives of my only son and his incredibly arrogant wife. I took another slow, deeply appreciative sip of my coffee, feeling the warm liquid soothe the last remaining traces of tension in my chest. My smartphone rested flat on the polished glass table next to my espresso cup. The screen remained entirely dark for several long minutes as Robert concluded his detailed surveillance report and quietly ended our secure call. He confirmed that the furious parents had already ordered a separate taxi, completely abandoning their disgraced daughter and humiliated son-in-law on the side of the road. I knew exactly what was going to happen next. Derek would aggressively cycle through the standard stages of grief and absolute panic. He would furiously attempt to unlock his frozen bank applications. He would desperately try to contact the corporate real estate agency listed on that massive red sign in the front yard. And finally, when absolutely every single avenue of escape had been brutally slammed shut in his face, he would be forced to call the one man he had so callously plotted to lock away in a sterile medical facility. Right on cue, the smartphone illuminated, vibrating harshly against the smooth glass surface. The caller identification displayed Derek's name. I did not answer it immediately. I sat back in my plush chair and watched the bright screen flash, allowing the incoming call to ring 5 distinct times. I wanted him to sweat. I wanted the cold, undeniable terror of his absolute financial ruin to completely saturate his mind before he heard my voice. On the 6th ring, I calmly reached out, picked up the device, and pressed the green button. I brought the phone to my ear, remaining perfectly intentionally silent. "Dad." Derek screamed into the receiver, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, unfamiliar hysteria. "Dad. What the hell is going on? Where are you? You need to fix this right now. Our house is completely locked up. There are heavy wooden boards over the front windows. Some insane construction company threw all of our clothes in a pile of garbage on the street." I could hear the chaotic sounds of passing traffic roaring in the background, mixed heavily with the sharp, shrill sounds of Monica violently sobbing. She was audibly wailing, a continuous, breathless sound of pure, unadulterated material loss. "My bank accounts are empty." Derek continued, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "The joint emergency fund is completely wiped out. My personal debit cards are declining. The cruise line entirely humiliated us. They locked our cabin cards. Monica's parents just left us standing on the sidewalk. You have to call the bank immediately. You have to call the police. Someone stole our identity. Someone stole the house. Dad, you have to do something right now." He was practically hyperventilating, desperately clinging to the incredibly fragile hope that this was all just a massive, catastrophic mistake. He was still trying to play the traditional role of the concerned, innocent son, relying on his wealthy father to immediately swoop in and financially rescue him. I took a slow, deep breath, letting his frantic, pathetic demands hang heavily in the digital connection between us. When I finally spoke, my voice was a smooth, chillingly calm whisper of absolute, unyielding authority. "I do not have Alzheimer's, son," I stated, enunciating every single syllable with razor-sharp precision. "But I did have a profound, life-altering epiphany." The dead silence that instantly fell over the other end of the line was absolute perfection. The chaotic background noise of the street seemed to completely freeze. Even Monica's hysterical wailing momentarily choked to a sudden, terrified halt. The sheer, undeniable weight of my words slammed directly into his chest. He suddenly realized that I knew absolutely everything. I did not wait for him to formulate a pathetic, desperate lie. I methodically laid out the complete, inescapable reality of his brand-new existence. "I sold the house, Derek," I continued, my tone completely devoid of any parental warmth or lingering mercy. "I liquidated the entire Bellevue property to a corporate cash buyer 2 days ago. I authorized a completely unconditional, strictly as-is transaction. That means every single piece of custom furniture, every designer handbag, and those expensive golf clubs you loved so much, legally belonged to the demolition crew. I explicitly instructed them to treat your possessions exactly like the absolute garbage you both proved yourselves to be." "Dad." "Please," Derek whimpered, his voice shrinking into a pathetic, broken whisper. "You cannot do this to us. You gave us that house. It was ours." "It was a revocable trust," I corrected him smoothly. "A trust that I permanently revoked the very same day you decided to formally cancel our family cruise through a cowardly text message. And those bank accounts you are currently crying about, I drained them. I legally transferred every single cent of my hard-earned cash into a highly secure solo account." "You have absolutely nothing left, Derek. You are officially bankrupt, totally homeless, and entirely cut off from the massive wealth you so arrogantly believed you were fully entitled to steal." No, you cannot leave us like this," Derek pleaded, the sound of genuine suffocating panic completely overtaking his words. "We have nowhere to sleep tonight. We do not have money for a basic hotel. We do not even have money for food. You have to help us. We are your family. You stopped being my family the exact moment you sat in that bedroom and actively plotted to lock me away in a medical prison," I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerous freezing register. "You thought you could legally declare me mentally incompetent and seize my entire fortune." I paused, listening to his terrified breathing. Monica started screaming in the background, begging me to forgive them. I completely ignored her and delivered the final blow. "By the way, Mitchell sent a copy of your fraudulent incapacity petition and the corrupt doctor's signature straight to the FBI for conspiracy to commit elder fraud." Derek let out a choked, horrifying sound. "You are looking at a very lengthy federal criminal indictment," I added. "I strongly suggest you use whatever loose change you have left to hire a defense attorney." I ended the call, picked up my premium travel bag, and confidently walked toward my gate, ready to begin my new life.